Well, thanks very much for inviting me along. Obviously, the main reason that I wanted to go to Palestine was so that I could see for myself exactly what's going on there and what the people of Palestine are enduring, and to come back and share that with as many people as possible. So this is my first attempt at sharing this to a wide public group, and I'm going to take it to an event in the Scottish Parliament soon as well. As you can see on the slide there, the trip was sponsored by the Council for European Palestinian Relations. That's an independent organisation funded largely from private donations. The delegation consisted of parliamentarians from the European Parliament, the Scottish Parliament, Westminster, the Belgian Senate, and there was also a German and Luxembourg parliamentarians. We visited Jordan before going on to go to East Jerusalem and wider afield in the West Bank. See this in work? Yeah. So that was the group who were there in terms of parliamentarians. So from the left, it was quite an interesting mix, not the kind of mix of politicians you might have expected going on such a trip. The woman on the left is Karen Lumley. She's a Conservative MP. The guy just next is Senator Piet de Bruin from the New Flemish Alliance in the Belgian Senate. That's then myself, obviously, and Bob Lackman, who's also a Conservative MP for someplace near London, someplace with a very large Jewish population. So he was coming from a very critical point of view. So it was very interesting to be having something like that in the tour. I think at the end of the day came back, maybe not pro-Palestine, but maybe a little bit more understanding of the complexities of the situation there. The chap next is Robert Goebbels, who's a Luxembourg MEP, he's a member of the Socialist Workers' Party there. The chap with the beard is Lord Hilton. I think he was originally a Conservative, but is now one of the elected independent lords. And the chap next is Lord Hugh Dykes, who is Lib Dem spokesman on foreign affairs in the House of Lords. He was the leader of the group. I think, again, he was formerly a Conservative before they kicked him out and he decided to join Lib Dem. So that was the chap at the back there is Arafat Shukri, so he was the organiser from the CEPR. And then the lady at the right is Alexandria Thane, who's an MEP for the Free Democratic Party in Germany, which I think they align themselves with the UK Liberals. Okay, our first, we flew into Jordan, and our first day in Amman, we met with the Jordanian Prime Minister, who at the time was Dr. Marfoud al-Bihit. The discussion at that meeting was very much about, first of all, the Jordanian take on the Palestine-Israeli situation, but also we had a quite frank discussion about the Arab Spring. And it did seem that the Prime Minister was keen to advance the Arab Spring in Jordan. He wasn't terribly rushed about how that should happen and felt that Jordan was already maybe a lot further ahead than other places. That caught up on the Prime Minister, and not long after we left, the King of Jordan had removed him from his position and replaced him with somebody else on the basis of the need to try and move the Arab Spring forward and bring democracy to Jordan at a faster pace. There's obviously still some way to go there, but it was interesting to be there just in the middle of that time where you had an old guard really who was resistant to proper democratisation, moving into somebody who hopefully will help move that forward in that country at the kind of pace that the people there want. But our initial discussions were about the Jordanian take on Palestine, and a lot of the concerns that the Jordanians have would be in terms of refugee status and the right of refugees to return to Palestine. They were keen to point out the slightly different situation that Palestinians have in Jordan, where they're allowed to work and allowed to be in government, compared to places like Lebanon, where actually the Palestinian people and refugees in Lebanon are treated very much like a third class and separate from the Lebanese people. On the first morning of Sunday, we crossed into Palestine via the Albi Bridge. That was a little bit of an experience. It took a long time. Going through the Jordanian side of that, I made the mistake of thinking I could take a picture just off the scenery to be very quickly have a gun pointed at me and told to put my camera down, so there's no more pictures, and I think I deleted that one in case I got into trouble going in. It took us a bit of time, mainly sitting waiting, watching Israeli cars driving past. There was clearly a two-track system getting into Palestine. If you had an Israeli number plate, then you were getting through much faster than we were. But apart from the annoyance of being overtaken by other people, it wasn't too bad, and we got in. We got to a hotel in East Jerusalem. Our first trip then in there was to meet some Palestine Legislative Council members who were seeking the protection of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Now these are people who had warrants put out on them basically because they were parliamentarians for a party that the Israelis didn't support and didn't like the fact that they had been elected. The guys had been under the protection of the Red Cross for some time, but in spite of that, Israeli authorities had gone in and just about a month, I think, before we were there in September, removed one of their party from what should in effect be internationally protected land belonging to the Red Cross. It was actually a really interesting discussion that we had with these guys. Our two Tory colleagues were very keen to always try and paint everyone as being, just a little bit not into democracy, and like, oh, you're Hamas, aren't you? And so they were trying to say, like, what did the guy at the left there was specifically asked, what did you do before you were elected? Thinking he was a terrorist or something. He wasn't. He was a college lecturer, and he's a college lecturer who put himself forward to be elected to represent his people and had duly been elected, and for that there is a warrant out for them. We had a really interesting lunch, and we were able to talk quite frankly there with some of the people. One of the discussions that were coming up is about elections, and there was clearly a split opinion between the Palestinians about whether elections should go ahead or not. Some of them were sort of saying, well, what's the point of having elections, because they're not going to be recognised anyway, unless they decide that the Israelis and the Americans want to win wins, then would an election be truly democratic if there's only one side. So that was an interesting debate. We then went on. We then went on to a tour of the Old City with Dr. Nazim Jubin, who's a renowned Palestinian archaeologist and professor at Brixton University. The main reason we were going there was to see some excavations which were happening under the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the argument being that these excavations, which were trying to uncover as much Jewish heritage as possible within East Jerusalem, were actually potentially threatening the mosque. It was very selective excavations. To be honest, it wasn't the most convincing experience that, in terms of seeing the evidence for that. What wasn't the best. We were able to look through some cracks and see some excavations down there. Whether it was deliberate, whether it was genuinely about the Judaism of East Jerusalem wasn't very clear. But what was clear was that East Jerusalem had traditionally been not just the Arab part of Jerusalem, but actually a very multicultural city. The Old City was very multicultural. Dr. Jubin himself told us that he was brought up within what would be classified as the Jewish quarter. And actually, when people talk about quarters, while now perhaps parts of Jerusalem have become very much Jewish or Christian or Muslim, historically, Jerusalem is a very multicultural city where people actually were able to live together irrespective of religion, and it's a real shame that that's being lost now with what's happening in that city. Sorry, the picture up here actually was one of the kind of starkest examples of the Israeli state putting their finger prints on the mainly Muslim area of East Jerusalem. That's a house that Sharon bought. Nobody's ever lived in it, but as you can see, it's all covered in Jewish, the Israeli flag and the Jewish items at the top. Very much as a statement to say this is ours. And obviously the people of Palestine are not allowed to put the Palestinian flag up in exactly the same streets where most people would classify themselves as Palestinian. So that's again about the Israeli state putting its mark on the people and reminding the people there who's in charge. I thought that was very stark. And it was obviously police controlling that particular part of the city. This is just a quick map to orientate people of Jerusalem. And a couple of the areas that we visited was up here, Sheikh Jarrah, which I'll be covering in a minute, and Silwan down here. So Sheikh Jarrah was the first area where we went to, and it's an area of East Jerusalem where a number of Palestinians evicted from what would now be classified as Israel had been given some houses in this area, this piece of land in East Jerusalem. They were under the protectorate of the Jordanian government, and basically the Jordanian government were told them that if they behave themselves, if they look after the property, then it would be theirs after a period of time. Obviously with the history of 1967 and how things were moving so much, they never actually got the paperwork to say that the houses were theirs, although they did get permission to do extensions, etc., on the basis, well, these are your houses. However, the Israeli government have said, well, you don't have any proof that these are your houses, so when a number of Israeli organisations come in and basically say, well, no, that's our house, and it's much easier for them to argue possession of the land, and basically people are being evicted. And this lady here, Miriam, that's her standing outside what, as far as she's concerned, is her house, but you can see the Israeli flags all over it. She's been removed from that house and is homeless. She stayed in the street just in front of that for a period of time in a tent. But obviously the authorities are not prepared to support Miriam and her family, but they're supporting the people who are occupying her house. And the challenge that they have is going through the legal system, that at the time when this was happening for Miriam, it was impossible to get a non-Israeli legal representation in the area, and these families had somebody who represented them that didn't represent them perhaps as well as they can. But I think even if they had the best legal advice, it would be very challenging for them to retain their houses. So Miriam still has the dream of moving back to her house. Right across the road from that, we went to another house of another gentleman whose mother had been removed from her. It's basically a small extension onto the house, a granny flat. The authorities said you've got no permission to build that there, so you have to leave. And the building is occupied by what would appear to be a number of youths. They stay there, they take turns using it almost as a clubhouse. So the grandmother, who looked about 60, 70-year-old roughly, was not allowed to go into the annex to the main house because it was being used by basically as a youth hostel and a clubhouse. And that was heart-wrenching that this lady was that was her home at that age. You don't have your home just because of your nationality. It was heart-wrenching. And she was obviously worried not just for herself but for what was coming to her younger generations, her granddaughter who was there as well, and how they were going to survive. In 1967, it's estimated there's been over 15,000 Palestinians who've been deported from East Jerusalem, and that's something that's continuing to happen, and it's something that the international community really needs to stand up and do something about. In the evening, we met up with the High Follow-Up Committee for Arab Citizens of Israel. So these were Arab and some Christian, actually, members, but all Palestinian members of the Knesset, Israel's parliament. And it was really interesting hearing from their point of view the challenges that they had to try and defend the Arab population, both Christian and Muslim, They had the support of some Jewish members of the Knesset, but it was really interesting to hear the challenges that they had and their aspirations. Their aspirations were different from other people that we met, and their aspirations were very much to see an Israel which was simply treated all citizens equally, and there wasn't, they didn't have the challenge about, I think ultimately, like most people in the area, they accepted the 1967 boundaries, but their main point was that the state of Israel really should get to the point where it's respecting all people irrespective of their religion, which they were quite clear that they currently didn't. We also met with some members of the Association of Civil Rights in Israel, who on that day were able to tell us about the plans that the Israeli government had to expel 30,000 Bedouin Arabs from the Negev Desert, and they were particularly concerned about a piece of legislation which is currently going through, being drafted in Israel, which would effectively outlaw the use of the Arab language within the state of Israel, a real challenge for Israeli Arabs in the future. The next day was a pretty hectic day, lots of travelling. Our first meeting was with the Legal Centre for Arab Minority Rights in Israel, Adalah. That was actually very disappointing. The people that gave us that came from Adalah were very, very passionate, but you know, it was a 100% propaganda, which, you know, we can get propaganda off the internet if we want. So that was disappointing because there wasn't any opportunity to interact at all there. But they were followed up by the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. These are largely Jewish Israeli organisation trying to support people whose houses have been demolished by the authorities, and basically their line was that they would stand by someone and rebuild the house and rebuild the house and rebuild the house. And I guess it's a small statement, but you know, to know that there's people in Israel who are prepared to do that, stand by their fellow man, is obviously very, very important. It's very important for them that they were doing that. Yeah. The picture on the left is Silwan, and you can see the density of Silwan. Silwan's just on the edge of the city of David, which is obviously a very important tourist attraction in Jerusalem, and it's also obviously the home of thousands and thousands of people. And the Israeli authorities think it would be a really good idea if, rather than all those people living there, that was all demolished, cleared, and a nice green park was there. And so there's a process ongoing to remove all the people from these houses one by one and replace the area with a park for the tourists. And again, that was absolutely heart-wrenching to hear the stories of some of the people who'd already been removed and other people who were living in fear of, you know, when is it going to be their turn, when is it going to be their houses that will be removed to create the Israeli National Park. En route to our next meeting, we passed through a number of very well-developed settlements, but this was quite stark here, and this was a new settlement that was being planned, and it's already an area which is already cordoned off by the Israeli police, and the Israeli court have rejected an appeal by local Arab residents that they had any right to the land. So the plans are for a 480 apartment neighbourhood. You can see where it's targeted. If you look carefully here, US Sales Department. This is not for people from Israel or Palestine. This is for people in the United States of America to come across and colonise this area. And you know, that's obviously what's been going on for a long time, and it's obviously still happening. But huge funds from the US government are being used to remove the land from Palestinian people and pass it over and out of their control. We then had one of our very many meetings, but this was an interesting meeting with John Gat-Rutter, who's the provisional EU representative in the West Bank. and also Mr. Sergio Piccolo from the European Commission. Both politicians, civil servants, sorry, were very keen to distinguish the European Union as being a positive influence in the area, much more so than perhaps the United States are, and they were keen to go over some of the efforts that they'd had, and they were also keen to quietly and privately support the UN bid that was ongoing, and they felt that that would be a very important progression for the Palestinian people. That's just a notion I watched. Okay, later that day we went down to Hebron, where we met with the Speaker of the Palestinian Legislative Council, Dr. Aziz Douak, who also describes himself as Palestine's second president. Dr. Douak became the Speaker of the Palestinian Legislative Council in January 2006, following the surprise victory of Hamas and Hamas's change and reform movement. Dr. Douak was then arrested by Israeli authorities in August 2006 simply for being a member of a political party. He maintains that his arrest was motivated purely by politics and has accused Israelis of violating international law. He was finally released in 2009. Now, many Palestinians consider Dr. Douak to be the acting president of the Palestinian Authority. The Constitution says that if there wasn't an election in January 2009, then the presidency should pass on to him as being the person. But that obviously hasn't happened, and the international community just would not tolerate that to happen. That said, it was interesting to be taken around the area to see the challenges in the area and to hear their experiences as politicians there. Dr. Douak then took us on a tour of Hebron. The picture on the left was actually taken by me, the one on the right wasn't. It was quite late by the time we managed to do it to the city, but that's the city square in Hebron, where a settlement has been established itself right in the city square. So as well as the city square being removed from use, you can see the buildings here are all vacated. These are all very historic buildings, and it would be illegal for them to occupy them. One of the other things that we could see on the streets of Hebron was the requirement to have netting above the streets, because the settlers would throw the rubbish and shoes and stones down on the street, and make it very difficult for the Palestinian people below to go about their daily work. One of the other challenges in Hebron was is the Abraham Mosque, or the cave of the patriarchs in the sanctuary of Abraham. Now, clearly, it's a very important religious building to both Muslims and Christians and Jews, but the Israelis have decided it's part of their national heritage and have effectively annexed that body, in spite of opposition from the international community, including UNESCO, which makes it very clear that the mosque is an integral part of the occupied Palestinian territories. The next day, we visited the Palestinian Ministry of State in Ramallah. Our delegation met with Salam Fayyad, who's the Fatah-aligned Prime Minister of the PLC. That was interesting. You could see, you could smell the corruption in the building. You could see the huge expense that had been spent on the wall at the back. You can understand why people fell out with Fatah. The kind of priorities from the discussions we had were very different. It was about the language that Dr. Fayyad was using was their aim to move Palestine by next year, by 2012, to a state of requiring no external support. And how you can do that without causing inflicting great misery on people in Palestine so quickly, I couldn't understand. There didn't seem to be a plan. It was just up here in the ether. However, we did manage to cover a number of points. One of the main things that we wanted to try and understand was about when there would be elections, and it did seem that there was a keenness then to find a way to work across the factions in Palestine to find a way to have the elections as soon as possible. So, and that seems to be moving at some pace. Okay, this picture is just showing the degree of segregation and in terms of the walls. We met with the Stop the Wall campaign at dinner that night, and some really passionate people. The International Court of Justice has made it very clear that the walls are being constructed are illegal, but they're still being constructed. So it was interesting to hear the grassroots campaign, the Stop the Wall campaign, which is trying to fight against the wall. The Stop the Wall campaign have four main goals: the immediate cessation of the building of the wall, the dismantling of all parts of the wall and its related zones already built, the return of land confiscated from the paths of the wall, and compensation for damages and lost income due to the destruction of land and property, in addition to the restitution of the land. So I've got some pictures of some arty pictures there. The pictures at the bottom here are some actual pictures of the wall, and you can see how folk have tried to use it in order to get some graffiti, some political graffiti on the walls. But it was quite stark driving through the countryside when you would see an Arab settlement and there was a wall, and then you would see an Israeli settlement. The wall was always, if the wall was about protection of the Israeli settlement, then why was the wall right by the Arab village, the Arab town, rather than a defensive structure that would have been close to what it was defending? But it was always close to the Arab community and cutting off huge sections of land, making it really difficult for many of the farmers to access their olive groves. A real challenge, but obviously a challenge that people are trying to fight against. Okay, this is just a quick slide showing the breakdown of the political landscape after the last election in Palestine. Green was Hamas, red was Fatah, and we often hear about how Fatah did really well in Gaza. Well, actually, they did really well everywhere. And that's going to be one of the challenges: how you can move from a situation where people had an election and the powers that be didn't like the result. And so how can you then go back? And I think that's going to be one of the challenges. We then met the Palestinian National Initiative Secretary, Dr. Mustafa Margouti. Now, I only very briefly said hello to him. I was told I had to go up and say hello to him, and then that was when I went off to visit Nablus. But the others said it was an interesting discussion that they had, and he was talking about some of the arrangements they had with the Egyptians, but I wasn't there, so I'm going to just skip right on to the next slide. This actually happened after I'd been to Nablus, but we visited the EU Pol Cops. So EU Pol Cops are very much involved in enabling the Palestinian police services in order to keep control and peace within Palestinian territories. And they were certainly all of the view that they had made considerable progress, and that the Palestinian police were actually now in a position that they were actually able to have some confidence and confidence of the Palestinian people. Obviously, the challenge they have is that within entirely Palestinian controlled areas they can respond quickly, and that's fine, but then within some of the other areas they have to get permission from the Israeli forces before they can go in and deal with this disturbance, by which time whatever disturbance was might have escalated, and that means that people in those areas have less confidence in the authority of the Palestinian police forces. So So there's a bit to go, but obviously the occupation has a huge impact on the ability of the Palestinian authorities to police the area. Okay, so just prior to that was when I went to Nablus, and that was quite an experience. The mayor sent a minibus to Ramallah, which was great, and it's a really nice minibus. Went on the minibus, we had all the papers required to get to Nablus from Ramallah. It's not terribly far away, but at the very first checkpoint, the 21-year-old Israeli soldier with a big gun decided that he didn't like the paperwork and so tough. So instead of using the nice road that took us that way, we had to turn around and take the not so nice road that went the other way. But again, that was an experience in terms of seeing what Palestinian people have to deal with every single day. It's, you have these perfectly good roads, and you can't use them. On the trip to Nablus using the back road, again, that was an eye-opener for me in terms of seeing the number of settlements that were appearing. Virtually on every high point there appeared to be a new settlement. So rather than trying to consolidate the settlements, it was very much about taking all the vantage points, and obviously with the impact of the area around the settlement being effectively no longer accessible by the Palestinian people. So that was a real challenge, and that was a real eye-opener for me just to see that happening, because whereas other areas, some of the settlements have been there for a reasonably long time, were quite developed. These were new settlements that were appearing all the time. You could see the impacts. I mean, there was one Arab road where the settlers' road had gone across the front of the entrance to the town, the village, and it was meant that those people could no longer use the main entrance to the village. They had to use a back entrance to get in, and just no regard for the other people there. However, we got to Nablus, and I was taken around the old city, and I then met with Adli Yesh, the mayor of Nablus. Mr. Yesh was first elected in 2005. He was a change in reform candidate, hugely popular. He secured more than 70% of the vote in the election. So I think, we'd all have to acknowledge you don't get that kind of vote unless you're extremely popular. I think there's a list with several candidates, but he achieved over 70% of the vote there. Obviously, his punishment for that was to be quickly put in jail, and he spent over 15 months in Israeli jail with no charge, before being released. But in spite of all that, I was absolutely so impressed with the passion that Adli had for doing his job as mayor. In spite of everything that was going on, it was always about how he could make sure he could provide the best services and the best future for the people of Nablus. He was passionate about making sure that children in Nablus got the education they deserve. And he said, it's not their fault what's happening. It's not their fault, so they need to get the right to have their education. He talked about how they were getting around the Israeli government's refusal to allow them to drill for more water. So there's a rule that basically says that the city isn't allowed to drill any more water wells on their land, because while the agreement says that land is yours in Nablus, what's under the land and what's above the land belongs to Israel, and that's the kind of line that they took. But they've got around it by working with some German mechanics, engineers, to find ways of getting more water out of the wells that were there. So it's always about how you could get around the circumstance and provide for the city of Nablus. But one of the most revealing things was when he was showing us his, I don't know if folk know the new Dundee house. It's a one-stop shop for the city services, and he was showing us their one-stop shop, and he was so proud that people in Nablus could come in, and he was showing me the paperwork about how they check, if somebody comes in with a complaint or an issue, and how it's all recorded in order to make sure that the people in Nablus feel that they're getting the best possible service from the city. His argument was that you absolutely had to do that if they were going to succeed, because for years the people in Nablus and elsewhere in Palestine had been very much part of a movement of non-cooperation with authority. And so now when you have some Palestinian authority, well, why is that different from Israeli authority? It's just authority. And so they had to show that actually the difference is that the Palestinian authorities are going to try and provide better services for you. It's about what's best for the people. And he was so passionate about that. It was really good to see. That's just a map showing some of the checkpoints from around Nablus. I can go back. I can't go back. One of the pictures with me with the mayor was from a new park that they've built on the mountains. But even there, if you go just a little bit past the park, there's an Israeli checkpoint. And again, on all the high points, there was Israeli checkpoints. And that's some more of them. Yeah, that's just another. It's the picture of the Nablus city. And I want to finish by just recognising the trip that was happening just after I was there, and sort of just at the same time the FPU moving two fire engines to Nablus across Europe into Nablus, and it was really challenging for the guys that did that. But I think we're really proud that they made the journey, they got the engine there, and they got all the stuff to Nablus as well. So I think my trip was nothing compared to what these guys achieved. But I hope I've managed to share some of it with you. I'm happy to answer any questions.